I'm Christoph von Tomme, and welcome to the API Resilience Podcast. If you've ever wondered what it really is we do when we do APIs, and if you've wondered how APIs change organizations, our communities, and our society, look no further. This is the podcast you've been searching for.
Jeff Eaton, welcome.
My pleasure.
I have another whole topic that I want to talk with you about. Well, the semantic cache thing is really exciting. So I'm very excited.
I'm intrigued, because it clicked as soon as I heard it, but I'd never really thought about it in those terms before.
Yeah. So I'll come to that in a moment. So
yeah.
I'll start with some of the other stuff, and then we can go into the other thing I'm busy with is social practices. Have you heard of social practice theory?
Oh, no.
Oh, you're going to love this stuff. I think last time I might have talked to you about Alicia Guerrero, and I'm not sure. Dynamics in Action was
I think it rings a bell. I'm not sure if that's because you've posted about it and I've kind of spotted some stuff, or whether it was on the podcast. But yeah, that rings a bell at least.
So she wrote this. She did this work about constraints and how constraints can cause. Well, her primary thing, what I understand, and I need to listen back to it, but she has this. So she was thinking as a philosopher about causation, and how we have kind of like little by little drifted into this idea globally that the only causation that is true and valid is this if this then that causation. She's been doing this thinking about constraints as ways to have context-aware organisms or context-aware systems that are like reacting to their environment through these constraints. This is a very, very bad way of explaining it. But she writes about enabling constraints, constitutive constraints, and governing constraints. Her latest book is Context Changes Everything. And the idea is that, for example, an API is a constraint, is an enabling constraint, because it constrains the information that flows through the API, but at the same time, which you normally, just logically thinking, you think well, that's going to reduce what you can do with it, but actually increase what you can do with it.
Enabling constraints is a sort of promise or a contract. A contract constrains, but because it is a guarantee and a promise, it enables new things to be done without renegotiating every moment.
And this goes way, way deep, because it's not only for contracts. This is also like oxygen is a governing constraint, because there's oxygen everywhere on the planet. Now, living organisms basically have been built around this governing constraint that then makes certain things plausible and possible that otherwise wouldn't be possible.
Oh, and that would also imply invisible constraints, things that were ubiquitous or presumed to be present, even if they weren't articulated.
Yes.
They, down the line, be a governing constraint, even if later they become scarce, or you try to expand into an area where they're no longer there. Suddenly you realize, we have constraints we didn't realize.
Or you can have dead constraints that are like historical artifacts that are just still there, but they're no longer actually performing work anymore.
All they do is constrain the shape of what you can do, what's possible.
And then they can actually be bad for you or for an organism, because they still require work to maintain those constraints and to work around the constraint that they're offering, but they're no longer adding to the adaptivity of the organism or the system. Now, I'm sure I totally mangled her work. and I'm sure Mark Berger is cursing if he's listening to this. But she's an amazing person. Her books are very interesting, but can be a little bit complex. But
I was going to say, that sounds like a book that's dense.
But her work is very big in the complexity scene. And then also, when you start thinking about software systems, that a lot of that applies.
Oh, yeah.
So that's one. And then there's so I got introduced to her work by Mark Berger, when we had the complexity series on the podcast. And then also Mark also introduced me to Pierre Bourdieu, who wrote this theory of practice. And he's an anthropologist who is doing anthropological research. And it's about, how in the software world, we often like pretend that our tools are everything. So like people will buy a database no, they'll buy a CMS.
Oh, I feel like Karen should be here for this one because she like you do not have a tool problem.
Oh yeah.
You have a process problem or a culture problem or a governance problem. And 99% of the time, you just keep hitting it with tools, hoping that the behavior of the tool will magic away the actual issue.
Exactly. So she and Mark need to talk with each other. Yes. So Mark is like, he's been an entrepreneur. He had a CMS that got made obsolete by Drupal, interestingly enough. And then he became an agile coach, and he developed this maturity mapping methodology together with his partner. So maturity mapping is
Yeah, we've actually done like, some real lightweight maturity mapping stuff for a couple of clients. Yeah.
So I would be curious if it's the same maturity mapping, but
probably not. I mean, it was a fancy name we made on some boxes,
Yeah. So they work with like practice cards. For them, maturity mapping is about social practices, and this is based on the social practice theory, which is that. And now coming to the definition of social practice theory is that a social practice is where there's a competency, like a purpose and material aspect together that form a social practice. And then as practices become more mature, you might create more material aspects. Those material aspects might become tools that are like standardizing this process and then make it more ingrained. And then you need less competency to be able to execute that process, because now some of the constraints have moved into the tools. And the key thing, what they're using this in teams, is to evaluate. How to say? There's like these hidden processes in teams, or hidden practices where he gave the example of an organization he worked for where they had this really, really successful team. And they were like, oh, this is great. This team actually is so productive. We're going to split it in two, and we're going to make two teams from it. And guess what? Like, neither of the teams worked anymore because they had no idea. They didn't know who were the people that actually were carrying the practices that were making
practice existed as a kind of gestalt in the team, not an articulated practice both sets of people could then go and follow.
Exactly. So they've built out a methodology for making hidden social practices visible, and then for also helping organizations and teams to recognize how mature these practices are compared between different teams.
Very interesting, because that dovetails with work that Karen and I have been doing. The funny part is that we've been frustrated and dissatisfied with the label that we've been using for it, which is doctrine. Like the analogy was like, strategy, operations, tactics. These are phrases that are real familiar in like the content strategy world, but the idea of the underlying assumptions about the nature of the world in which our work exists, or the ecosystem of competitors and environmental constraints, like the capabilities constraints that we are working within, and thus informing our decisions about what is a viable tactic or not. Like those things go unarticulated and uncaptured in most cases, which means that over time, as change occurs or teams age out and the assumptions that led to certain decisions are just baked decisions now with no reasoning behind them, like things drift, essentially. The why drifts, and they either are lost as practice or they're codified as rules rather than treated as fluid responses to needs and environmental constraints. And like it's been really, really useful for us. But like the phrase, the label doctrine came out of like military doctrine, which articulates a lot of this kind of stuff. But like both the theology and military implications of it are a little are like, it feels a little iffy. And it's, I mean, maybe I'm reading too much into, maybe I'm just sort of seeing my current obsession everywhere, but like, this feels like it's got a lot of interesting overlap.
I am sure. So you definitely need to go talk. Well, I'll introduce you to Mark.
Absolutely.
So it's social practices, this constraints. Yeah, like Simon Wardley, I think you probably know the Wardley mapping.
Mm-hmm.
So because it was Simon Wardley, he talks about doctrine also, but I think doctrine is already materialized practices because they're
yes, yeah, like the distinction between doctrine and just talking about stuff is it's not really doctrine until it's articulated and captured, and there's an attempt to reproduce and systematize it. Before that, it's just talking,
Well, there's another step before that, because there's also the implicit knowledge, like the knowledge that you don't know that you have, and I think that is what the practices are. And what he talks, So what they talk about with social maturity mapping and social practice, like this practice cards, is that you can you can have different teams, like for example, code review, or working with tests, or doing documentation well, or single sourcing, or all of this. There's lots of sub practices that a team might be doing, and they don't even know that they're doing it, because they've somehow read something somewhere, and then they started kind of applying it. And
well, it's like a lot of the actual stuff wasn't like new ideas they came up with. It was capturing practices that they saw working and assembling them into a sort of body of practice.
Yes. So I think that's that. And then the third thought, the third thought, how do you call it? Thought school that I've been thinking about again is the pattern languages. Yep.
Yes. So have you read back into like some of the early days of like when it started making the crossover from Christopher Alexander's work to the computer science world?
So I've gone back to the source. I've been reading Christopher Alexander's work. Yes.
So one of the things that I find really fascinating about pattern languages and the sort of path they've taken is that, and Ward Cunningham, who like invented the wiki, the concept of the wiki, and I think, if I remember correctly, Kent Beck from the Gang of Four pattern language book, are the two guys who, I think it might have been as early as 1987, I tracked down the paper that they presented at a computer science conference about Christopher Alexander's work as a tool for working with some of these new complex problems. So like back even in the 80s, but sorry, I'm getting too excited. What I find really fascinating is that Christopher Alexander's initial work wasn't about creating a professional dialect for architects to communicate with each other more efficiently about architecture. It was a language for the people who would live and work and inhabit in buildings to communicate about their needs and intentions for the spaces, so that architects could understand why they were making certain things and talk about good solutions to those underlying patterns of needs. And when it made the crossover to the computer science world, like I got into, computer science. Well, I shouldn't say computer science. I became a programmer professionally around the time when when pattern language was really, really getting anchored in like the day-to-day practice of like consultancies and stuff. Yeah. And even then it was starting to become a running joke where like, oh yeah, you start a new project and you decide on the list of 9 patterns we're going to use to build this. And it was really evolving very quickly into like a professional language for software architects to talk to each other about how they were going to solve certain technical problems. Like somebody who wants to use a word processor doesn't say, oh, well, I'm definitely going to need my word processor to use the flyweight pattern to reduce memory usage. That's not it. And that's just, it's what's going on is useful, and it's good that information can be shared, but now it's a professional dialect used with software developers, and that idea of it being about need and intent for the end user and like that communication layer, that feels like it's an important aspect of it that's really been lost in how as a community we talk about pattern languages. And now you look at how design pattern libraries are treated as synonymous with a design system. And so the dictionary of patterns that we have is what we compose pages out of, because those are the visual pieces that things get made of. And the design patterns are almost like units of work for designers rather than something that reflects communicative or interactive intent from a creation standpoint. That idea of shifting, like putting the language back in the pattern language. It's like, how can this be a thing that we use to actually communicate about what's going on rather than just naming all the pieces we make a thing out of? Like that aspect of it is one of the things that I've found really, really interesting digging into the older writing about it.
So one of the big things we talked about with Mark, which came back over and over again, is the reductionist nature of how we think about the world. So basically, we've reduced patterns from like a living thing, or the pattern language as they were originally imagined they were not fully defined. The patterns themselves were alive. And now the way we use them, they've become this, basically we've reduced them into a highly strictly defined thing that has lost that ambiguity that is giving its life.
The pattern is still there, but the language is gone.
Yeah. So I've been thinking about all of this, and then we've been...
Oh, yeah, that's all. just a few simple things.
I don't know how much you know about what we're doing today as a business. So
I know what the website says.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we build developer portals, and we have had this constant tension where customers would come to us and say, oh, I don't want anything special. I just want what everybody else wants, but I want it to be exactly this way. So why don't you just build a product around exactly what I need so that I don't have to care about all these complexities and I can just buy your product and you maintain it and you make a lot of money and I can use this for cheap and it's going to be great. And that on the surface of that's because that sounds like reasonable and a lot of companies are doing exactly that. They're reducing a certain need into a very specific product, like streamlining needs into a singular product that then can be used by a lot of people. This is what we've been doing with industrialization all over the place. Now, personally, I don't feel good about that because I know that, I don't feel good about it. And also the customers that we work with, they always have different needs. And there's always something special and something...
I mean, we were talking about this 15 years ago in the Drupal community because of the tension between making this highly customizable kit for building CMSs, and then on the flip side, the pressure to make a sort of turnkey tool that does what someone expects for a particular kind of thing. And there's a huge amount of tension between those.
Right now, the choice we have is either you go full SaaS, like a turnkey SaaS, and then as a customer, you can build some customizations around that, maybe not all for all products, and then if the roadmap, and you're fully dependent on the roadmap of that product, and if they make up their minds to do something crazy, then
and if you're lucky, they give you something like a JSON blob field and the ability to use a custom React component to edit it, but that isn't necessarily integrated in a meaningful way with the architecture and the operation of the system.
Yes. But then the alternative is like the fully built custom, or well, it's not black and white, but there's then developers will then say like, well, forget about all this Drupal crap. Like, yeah, I don't need all of this crafty stuff that is just making it hard for me to do new things. I just want to start from scratch. And then we're sitting somewhere in the middle with Drupal, like the system that has a whole bunch of constraints built into it that might or might not make your life easier.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you deal with this? And so we have been, in how we work with our customers, we've been basically building, we have a platform, so which is a standard set of standards that we roll out for everybody. We upgrade all the sites for our customers. So we've basically created a sort of bespoke software as a SaaS software kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
where we maintain something that we've developed for a customer indefinitely. And we've been thinking about how do we, but still we get these customers asking us like, where's my features? Where do I get my free stuff? And or also like, why does it take so much time to figure out how to do this thing? Like I thought you had a product that just does these things. And so we've been doing a lot of soul searching about this. And then a while ago, our CTO came up with this concept of a prototype, which is, well, we've tried thinking about features where you could have like products that you would be able to install on your site, but that doesn't really work because
there's some of the things that are starting to get there with like the Drupal Starshot initiative and the recipe stuff, but like those are in the very early days.
So, but we had this. We've been doing stuff like this for our customers. We've been working on things like this for a while. We had this concept of prototypes that we've worked out. Now we're actually evaluating, can we actually use recipes to do what we're already doing.
So I actually dug around and I found the design documents for a system like this from 2008, early 2008, when Lullabot was working on Buzzer. If you remember way back in the days before Drupal Gardens, we worked on like SaaS-hosted, Drupal-based turnkey build your own site. And like the first thing we hit was exactly this need, the ability to take these composable building blocks that exist in the Drupal world for architecting content structures or presentation mechanisms or whatever, and to package up decisions made for how to use them into a meaningful unit. And some of the work that we did on that ended up getting rolled in and contributed into the features module eventually, which, is still early and crude by today's standards, but like, this is such a fascinating, like perennial challenge.
So what we figured out was that you cannot make a true product that you're going to maintain independently. So that instead, just like recipes, they're transformations or they're bundled set of transformations that you're doing on the site, and then you're maintaining the site as a whole. Because like you cannot maintain the individual pieces from which you compose a whole. Like this works in WordPress where you have a different type of modularity, because
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead. I've been neck deep in helping a client with a large WordPress build that they've got for the past several months. So I've got a lot of feelings about that. My hot take is that WordPress is just a triple store.
A triple store?
Functionally, you have hosts, which are everything. Everything is a post, a revision, a menu item, a menu, a draft of a post, attachments, permutations of attachments. Everything's just a post. Posts are posts, pages are posts, posts are posts. It's like a classic. We had one database table and come hell or high water, we were not going to add a second one kind of architecture. But then you have the meta table, which stores everything other than the existence of the post proper. It's literally everything is just named key value pairs hanging off of this thing, which means that the emergent data structure of any sufficiently complex WordPress site is basically just a triple store sitting on, it's functionally a triple store with posts as the sort of core node and the meta table as everything hanging off of them. But obviously it doesn't have the actual mechanisms of a triple store to support all that. So that's my somewhat snarky, opinionated hot take. Thank you for indulging me as I got that off my chest, because this has been weighing on me. But go on. The architecture of how you build this stuff out and how that what that implies for maintenance over time.
Well, because the way I understand it, but I'm not a developer, so I don't have that. So that insight, thank you for that, because I didn't know about the WordPress triple store, but the architecture, like the modularity that they have, is it's the same as with an app store with a phone where you can install an app and it's in a container. And
plugins are very much self-contained units, and if they interoperate with each other, it's because both developers went to the effort of manually building interaction points between their two plugins, not because there's this rich layers of APIs that everyone can layer on top of.
Exactly. And Drupal is like the opposite of that, because Drupal has this composable architecture where you install a module and it changes everything. And
CCK and views, I think, so radically changed the game, and even new things that aren't CCK and views ever since then follow that similar pattern of sometimes even to the community's detriment, where someone's like, I'm not making a plugin that does something, I'm inventing a kind of noun,
But like the AI module, it's like that. So it has its tentacles all over the place, and it now and that's what's so powerful about Drupal, is that it really they're free it's not a bundle of constraints that's defined to do one thing. It's the constraints that now gives you new capabilities in the system, and that's amazing. But with lots of with the complexities and the difficulties that comes from that. So how we are looking at creating an extension catalog, that's how we call it, but it's basically like a pattern catalog of different things that people want to do in a developer portal, and different ways how you might want to do them. And then either blueprints that explain how that works architecturally, or actual codes, prototypes that actually just do the thing that you're trying to do, that you can add to a site, just like a recipe, where it transforms the site so that now it has this capability, and it enables a couple of things, but then the maintenance of that thing still is happening at the site level. So you have the module level, where you have the module codes that you have to maintain, but then how these modules interact with each other, and then some of the glue codes that's sitting in between that you have to maintain on the site level. But this is how we're looking at, and how do we get customers to collaborate on prototypes? How do we accelerate development across an ecosystem? And it's you work together with the Drupal community on the module level, but then on this pattern level, you work on a smaller community where we have this small, very specialized community around developer portals, where potentially that is a closed garden, where you are working with the open source community on the primitives that enable those patterns, that it can feed itself and it can perpetuate itself. Well, so that there's a place where you cooperate, and there's a place where you compete with the community. That's the thing I've been thinking about. Also, how do you turn star shots into a moon base, from where you launch 1,000 star shots to all different stars? But then the pattern for Drupal companies for building a business that amplifies the community by focusing on marketing in a very specific niche, where they expand the use of Drupal by accelerating the development of not only of the modules that enable these things, but also of the patterns of usage, meaning a combination of both codes and social patterns of how do you use these systems.
So one of the things that I think is fascinating, and one of the challenges we ran into way back when doing this, and you sort of hinted at this with the idea of like, in addition to the sort of blueprint, there's also this idea of glue code that's necessary to wire stuff together. And this comes back to the distinction between patterns as a practitioner dialect versus patterns as a language for users to articulate need. One of the challenges, I think, is always, can someone like describe new patterns of use or define new needs without going down a level to the pure implementation and building out like the new code to write it? Like, is the described pattern something that literally makes the thing, or is it just a specification that a developer will then go and do? And that split has always kind of fascinated me because, again, there's constraints to the first approach, because anything your language can't articulate becomes functionally impossible to make if you actually use the descriptive language or the way of describing these patterns as how people control the thing. But if you go developers just kind of use this as the starting point to do their thing route, then you're still sort of locked in that world where it's difficult for anyone who isn't a programmer to really make use of the tool. And I think, as much as I despise visual page builders, particularly like in the WordPress ecosystem, where functionally they're an entirely separate layer of CMS slapped on top of the CMS with their own stuff, again, being shoved into meta fields where that triple store, each stored value in the triple store is itself a giant serialized blob of stuff that is being layered on top of the core CMS. But as much as the implementation of that frustrates me, and the limitation and the inherent problems that come with that frustrate me, it's now like 50% of the WordPress universe is being built with those tools because they do not require a developer to write new PHP code against the WordPress APIs in order to do a thing. It's something that someone uses the native conventions of like Elementor or whatever one of the plugin modules plugins they're using to do the page building. They use its sort of native vocabulary to compose pages that do the thing they need. And it's just there. They don't need to learn that underlying layer on top of which it's built. And again, all kinds of problems and challenges that go with the way that it's been implemented, but the level of desire for those tools, things that let people just build a thing. I think that's what CCK and Views brought to the Drupal world, because before they arrived, you added a new type of content to a Drupal site by opening up your text editor and writing a new PHP module and dropping it in and making database tables in a SQL, manually and all that stuff. And it was just, there were templates you could follow and stuff like that, but you could just do what you wanted. And CCK and Views radically transformed that, because people still had to figure out what was going on. They couldn't just use like natural language to do it, but you could click together things like, oh, I want this field and this field and this field, and I want this to appear at that URL, and then I want things to be listed in this way at this URL. And suddenly you got a whole generation of sites that were built on the vocabulary of a view and content types and fields rather than database tables and plugin modules. That was what got you to what you could click together. And, because of the natural progression of things, that ended up also getting complex enough that, people wanted a whole nother layer on top of it, which is how we're talking about these kinds of recipes and stuff like that. It's like, well, now that we've got so many primitives that we can build anything, now we need another layer on top of that to describe things. But that continuing ongoing pressure to move towards, well, I guess the language of articulating needs and solutions rather than technical implementations. That's such an evergreen cycle in what we do.
Well, it's like the edge of complexity, the fractal is growing. So the like new layer or new layer, and they're all self-similar, and it just keeps going and going and going.
Well, it's like, even in, computer science, we went from you program a computer by changing all the cables that are plugged into all of the different switches in different combinations to, well, what if we could have punch cards that you just fed into it to capture things, to what if we had software? And then what if we had a higher level language you could write that would then get compiled into the stuff the computer needs? And now we've got, like scripting languages on top of that, and now scripting languages being compiled by LLMs and, stuff like it. It's like we keep inventing these new layers of abstraction. And I think the easy temptation is to think of it as a process of simplifying things. Mm-hmm. But it's more that like every time we create a new layer to simplify things and sort of tidy up this messy layer of complexity that we've created to solve a bunch of problems, we're like, okay, well, we think we kind of figured things out. So let's sort of add a new floor on top of that and let people inhabit the next floor while, the programmers work in the mines underneath them. But then that next floor gets populated, and then it gets complicated. And then we keep making the layer cake, new layers of the cake on top of that. And like you said, it's like that natural fractal and growth to like the surface area of the problems we're trying to solve and the number of people that are trying to solve them. And that produces complexity. And those layers aren't just, oh, well, people keep wanting things simpler and simpler and simpler. It's like, no, the surface area that we're trying to cover is greater. So tools to do more with less keep being a necessary advance, if that makes sense.
And I think you're right. We're not simplifying, it's speciation. It's like if you have a very old rainforest, you get lots and lots and lots of new species, and like you have parasite of this one, and then there's a parasite of the parasite, and there's a parasite of the parasite of the parasite.
I like the idea of plug-in architectures as a kind of parasitism.
So So I think, but to bring it back, like what I've been busy with, so is there a way to describe the needs that people have when they're building, or they have an API team, or like an interface team, because it can be broader than an API team. Their needs for a developer portal, can we define a whole set of patterns of like, you want this kind of capability, you want this kind of practice to be possible, and then here's like the different variants that we know about, and here's for these two, we actually have a solution that you can just adopt, or we can build the extra variants that you're looking for, or we can invent something completely new. But if you reuse something, then you don't have to pay as much money. We'll maintain the whole thing like as is. Whatever we end up with, we will make sure that it keeps working. But it becomes like I've been calling this an upgrade SaaS, rather than like where we still have open source codes. So you're staying with like our customers stay with us as long as they want to keep having these upgrades. And it's not just maintenance, but it's like the ability to choose from patterns that we've developed with other customers or to build new patterns, and the prototypes that address them. Yeah, that's what I'm working on and thinking about. There's two topics that I thought we were going to talk about. So one is constraints and different systems and how they all need similar constraints, but they're just expressed differently. And I'll, like a static site generator, like if you do Doxus codes with static site generators, you need linters because otherwise you don't have constraints and it becomes a mess anyway.
You just got markdown, and God help you then.
Yeah, so that's actually what happens in the technical writer community. Or you go with a CMS, but then everybody is really complaining about all these crafty UIs that you have to deal with and how those are not necessarily user-friendly, but where you have the constraints of field validation that help to enforce the structured content and like in page validation or whatever you have. And where is it all going? Like for a very long time, like working in the technical writer, like in the dev portal space, where developers are very hostile against anything PHP, God forbid Drupal. That's like, it was this existential question. It's like, are we now all moving to static site generators? And like, are we going to abandon content management systems? And like, what is still the function of a content management system when you have all of this capability being built in this other tool chain? And I think the answer lies in the constraints. Like, are the constraints alive or are they dead? And how many of the constraints of content management systems are dead? And how many of them are actually alive and helping?
And by alive, you mean like evolving over time and responding to changing environments, or just a sort of baked set of constraints that describes this is the system, this is how it works, this is what it does?
It's like in the pattern language book, he talks about life patterns where like he talks about places. And I think it was not the pattern book, it was the other one from Christopher Alexander. I bought these two books and the title is escaping me now, but he talks about places that are dead, like where, somebody has designed this thing and like the actual patterns that should be there for people to actually be able to have the practices they need to make it feel alive are missing, because of which these things are just decaying without somebody willing to spend the efforts to keep maintaining the thing. And you have like, I think like multicellular life is a lot like that. You have this enormous genome with lots and lots of genes, and then lots of codes that's just like some, like 10,000 or 100,000 years ago, a virus invaded your ancestor, and it's still there. It's just sitting there. It's been replicated for 100,000 years from cell to cell to cell. It's not, as far as we can tell, it's not really fulfilling any function, but it's still piggybacking on that reproduction machine. And waiting for a day that maybe something weird happens and another virus cuts into it and like, boom, you have a new functionality. And then some cells actually become better from it or something like that. So you have this library of constraints that just sitting there waiting to be reactivated when they're going to be useful again. But that's not very efficient. But multicellular life just is not very efficient. but it's very it can be very effective in the right circumstances. Coming back to CMSs, like, are the constraints that we have built CMSs around, are they still going to be needed in the future or not? And is there maybe a way of doing Doxus codes where you are using Markdown, but maybe you have some sort of at least front matter for metadata or something, or like a certain template function or something like that to help you to create structured content, maybe with the right amount of linters that enforce the structure to be actually appropriate, that can help you. Or maybe you have an AI that just, like a bot that just parses all your documentation and then populates a piece of structured documentation and that brings it to the second topic, which is the idea of, I'll keep that for a little while. Like the semantic cache is coming.
Okay, because that again, that's particularly interesting to me because well, I was talking about, these things I've been digging up from the 90s, and old documents that I wrote or whatever. That's been part of like this, my sort of ridiculous hobby over the past probably year and a half or so has been refactoring my personal blog into a giant archive of everything I've made or published, regardless of source or destination, digitally ever. I will say that it sounds, it's a little self-indulgent. It sounds real cool in theory until you start actually looking back over things you wrote 25 years ago. And then it becomes sort of like the personal archiving version of body horror. You're like, oh my God, I can't believe I wrote that. But it's got its ups and downs. But what I found interesting is that once you start casting a wide enough net for the kinds of things you're trying to integrate into a body of content or a body of knowledge or a system of management or something like that, the tanglier it gets and the more clear it becomes that any modeling or structural decisions you're making are not in fact capturing some fundamental truth about the nature of a thing, but making calculated decisions about how you're going to have to work with things of a type and what you consider a type versus two types or something like that is in and of itself a whole other layer of decisions. Like, just as an example, one of the systems that I'm integrating into this is hoovering up all of my social media posts on micro blogging websites like Twitter/X. I think I shut down my account about a year ago, but I've got 12, 13, 14 years of back content that I was posting. So I was like, oh, I'll pull that in. It's like, oh, well, I've got my Mastodon account and I guess I've got my, Blue Sky account now. And I guess I posted some on Threads. And it's like, oh, well, what, the perfect opportunity. I'll pull those all in. And it's like, well, okay, what does it mean to do that? Does that mean I'm attempting to preserve the underlying platform by platform nature of differences in how they represent data and what they capture? Because although they're very similar, they're all, like Twitter, Blue Sky, Threads, and Mastodon. On the surface, you can look at all of them and say, oh, same thing going on there. But at the low architectural level, data storage, vastly different. Like the actual structure of a tweet when you look at the API responses or the downloaded archive, very different from what you get if you look at the AT protocol that Blue Sky uses and how its actual structures of a post are composed and where things go and how things get linked to each other. Similarly, Mastodon built on a different conceptual protocol and conceptual model of what are the nouns and verbs here. Yeah. Very different. You can theoretically collapse all of those into some shared concepts like a status update that is in reply to something and potentially makes up a thread if you want to always show a thread together. But do you do that by faithfully reproducing the data inherent in each one of the original sources and special casing each one to make them look the same or work the same? Or do you make your own sort of neutral, shared model that collapses that? Or do you say, well, actually, I only really care about the threads for this purpose. I only care about things that were long enough or meaningful enough to do that. So do you store them as individual things that are threaded together? Or do you essentially collapse all of those things into a piece of writing that may have originally been spread over multiple posts, but meaningfully, for convenience sake, is a single post that I will preserve and store? And none of those are about the thing. Those are they are semantic caching decisions. At what point am I going to collapse decisions about operations on these data into a new data structure that I will operate off of versus trying to natively operate on the original state of all data in where it originated from. And you can't, functionally, it just is impossible to do that, always operate on the original state of everything in any kind of efficient way. It's just overwhelming. And you see this in stuff like schema.org, which is, just an amazing project by a number of different organizations. I think it was really pioneered by the folks at Google and stuff like that. But it's basically a way of essentially announcing to search engines via semantic data embedded in a web page what's on this page meaningfully, what's the graph data that exists here. This is a web page about this other thing, and it contains these 2 articles and a reference to this person and this breadcrumb trail and these 3 actions. And what I find is fascinating is that schema.org has modeled out so many different kinds of structures in very detailed fashion that it's very easy to mistake for a content model, like the kind of thing that you would say oh, I need to do podcasts in our CMS. Oh, well, I'll go to look at schema.org. What does it model for a podcast? And you can do that. But the problem is it's a language for describing what search engines are looking for on pages, not for describing what you do and create and work with when constructing a podcast. There's overlap to them, but it turns out there's material differences in what you're doing in order to produce the stuff and what you're capturing and saving and recording. Even if ultimately down the line it gets exposed as schema.org data, it's a caching layer, or I've called it a serialization format for graph data about your content, not the native shape of your content. And that idea of what's the thing and what are the forms we use to expose that thing's nature to different types of endpoints, but understanding that distinction between the nature of the thing as a philosophical entity. What is podcastness? What is, what makes a thing a podcast? Is it still a podcast if there's a video, or is it a webinar? Well, what's the difference between a webinar and just a podcast that happens to have a video channel? Those are philosophical questions that may not even be reflected in the data model that gets exposed to something like schema.org, but could really significantly affect how you create and how you manage and what you store and how you operate on the stuff. And, again, it's these are complicated decisions about what is needed and what is being done, not inherent, objectively true descriptions of, type theory or something.
You can't reduce them to the schema.org. You can reduce content to schema.org, but something is lost in the process.
Or you end up squeezing it into weird shapes to fit that and use that representational language.
And it's the same thing as what's happening with when you project value into money. And it's the same thing as when you have something that's alive and now you are reducing it to a single dimension. A lot of stuff is lost.
Money is a serialization format for value. I like that.
Yeah. So, and I think what is lost is the social practices that actually got us started with this whole stuff. So when you're doing a podcast, you're not doing it to produce audio formats. Well, hopefully you're not. Like
Just really love OG files. That's my passion, you know.
I need to create a lot of them. so you're doing that because you want to have a conversation, and you want, and you also want to like share with the world, and you want to have interactions with people. And there's a lot of very personal things that you're trying to achieve. And then the actual podcast is like a residue of that alive thing that happened. And when we're looking at the world only as the residues that are left over from all those social practices, we make the world a lot poorer. At the same time, finding ways to make those residues better accessible so that people can do more interesting things with it can be very, very useful. And I think that is that part about semantic caching that disconnects. But what is your feeling about content management systems? Like, do you see obvious dead constraints in them, and that you imagine that soon we will actually no longer need? Or do you think, like, what with all this bloaty interface stuff that we've talked about in the past, like how do you feel about these things? Because it feels like people have this idea that now that we have AI, we'll just be able to talk to it and it will like squirrel away the information, and we no longer have to deal with these pesky, stupid graphical interface systems. Is that true? Do you see a future where that could happen? Yeah.
So, I mean, in the classic manner of annoying, pedantic nerds,
Go for it.
I'll say, I'm never sure if I'm trolling when I say this, or if I'm like how seriously I am when I say this, but let's say I'm just dead serious. But I think I categorize a content management system as whatever systems and tools you use to manage your content. Like, just taken literally at face value, what does that phrase, a content management system, mean? And in that sense, if you look at like a static site generator that, quote, doesn't have a CMS, it does. Mm-hmm. It absolutely does. But GitHub is the CMS. The CMS is the affordances for pull requests and merges and approvals, and either in browser editing or on disk editing that it allows you to use. That is your CMS at that point. And you can say, well, it's not really, but it is functionally. That has become your CMS. And even with static site generators, there's this sort of new generation of lightweight Git-backed CMSs that, it's like, just edit markdown files and stuff like that. But they too they inevitably accumulate many of the same points of complexity that database-backed CMSs accumulated over time, because I guess now we have to have some way of managing complicated menu hierarchies. And I guess we could put it all in the front matter, but what if it's really difficult for somebody to remember all that? Well, now we need a system to grab certain properties in the front matter and make those a UI that you can use. It's like, there's nothing wrong with that, but sort of like the layers of complexity we were talking about, like the more you do with a thing, the bigger the footprint of it is, the more complexity there is, and the more temptation/need there is to build supporting tools that codify the practices that you want on top of that. And I think that's sort of the point of tension that a lot of static site tools are now at, where they've got this tool that, like, the distance between I write this stuff and it shows up on the website feels much smaller than it did in the old days where, oh, well, we're going to model out a bunch of these concepts as like Drupal fields or, or WYSIWYG editor plugins or whatever. You just write your document using whatever conventions your team has or whatever. That it feels like it's reduced a lot of the distance, but then you get into things like, oh, well, now we also need a linting system to make sure that the code samples that you put in there are actually executable code. But, well, what about if we're actually, the snippet of code is actually just a small chunk of something that requires external libraries to actually be executed? So either we decide, well, we're not going to promise it works, but we're at least going to promise it parses if it appears here. You're already making judgment calls about what it means to have code in a thing and what systems it needs to process through. Things like, what is the state of a document reflects complicated multiple variables, not just am I done with it or has it been approved and published, but like what is its validation state in what could be a time, a timed process that has to execute before its validity can even be determined. It's not just like, yes, you filled out this field, or no, that's not a phone number. It's like, oh, well, has the test suite run on the dock yet? And that's not even just with code. There's tools like Veil. It's a linting tool for English language that people have written plugins for it to codify things like the U.S. Digital Services guidelines for readable content and stuff like that. And you can run that against English language and grammar checkers or things like that. It's like, well, okay, well, what does it mean for it to be in those states? It's just a markdown file. It's just sitting there. Like, does that mean now we've got another YAML property in the front matter that gets touched and updated every time one of those things happens? Or like, how do you handle branching revisions of two different things? Is that two files, or is that just, Git handles that? That's Git branches, branching and merging. If you've got the live version and the in progress version, and a hotfix means the live version has to get updated immediately before the in progress version is finished. I mean, that's a perennial challenge in content management, regardless of what your domain is. But like with API versioning and stuff like that, it's like, well, that really matters, because things are no longer accurate if we can't solve that problem. And for that reason, I think the challenge of content management is never going to go away. But different sort of generational paradigms in how you handle storage, or where the complexity has to live for a system to operate, or how knowledgeable and well-trained and disciplined the editors have to be, versus how much hand-holding and assistance the system will give them in the process of, in the creative process. Those kinds of things, I think, ebb and flow and shift as, development processes change and technologies evolve and new categories of need emerge and stuff like that. But that underlying challenge of, we're trying to wrangle a bunch of complicated stuff, and it goes beyond simply, is this done or not done, or is this, that is content management. That is the problem space of content management. And I think tools to make that process work, and to make it better or smoother, or to shift the complexity to different areas so that different teams can focus on certain types of work, that's always going to be there. It's always going to be a need. And I think the sort of meteoric rise, the explosion of static site generators to solve a bunch of these things grew out of how radically they simplified certain simple scenarios that previously were just very complicated to try to use. Sort of like, I want to build a blog with Drupal. It's like, well, you can, but, I hope you like building things because, you're going to do that. And we see similar stuff with the decoupled API, pure structured content in an API. Don't just model your stuff and it lives in a SaaS product or in a self-hosted product. And then your other tools consume stuff from it that'll simplify everything. Well, what emerged was, either you're just kind of making a spicy database that's got some optimizations for content and it's somebody else's problem how you interact with it, or your wonderful content API ends up turning into a complicated content management system just because of what people need to do with that stuff. That's inescapable. And I think you've seen that in the decoupled space, particularly with Contentful as it's grown and evolved over time. And Sanity.io is another one that I've, spent a lot of time sort of under the hood with. And both of them sort of kicked off very early on with that idea of, man, this is so much simpler. It's so much smoother. You're not dealing with all the cruft of, your big old legacy CMS. Yeah. But as they accumulated use cases, the inherent complexity of content management reared its head, and they have had to grow and expand and accumulate complexity just in order to solve those kinds of problems like revisioning and language control and typing and sharing elements across things to single source components. How, those are not purely technical problems. Those are workflow and conceptual model problems. And then on top of that, you've still got your layers that need to do that. And with, markdown files or DITA or whatever formats that are there, one answer is, you don't need a system. You just train the authors on how to use your DITA specializations and they write the documents and then you lint them. Or you say, oh no, it's markdown. It's just so simple. You don't even need to train people. It's just obvious. If all you need to do is italicize things and underline things, sure, it's obvious and intuitive, but then every system built with it accumulates. It's and these are the 6 special things we do with Markdown, and where you do a $ and then enclose it in brackets if you want to mark it as this thing. And our Markdown parser does that. It's okay, you've made a markup language now, and that's why assistive editors got created, and those layers start accumulating all over again. I'm just repeating myself here, but I think this is the problem space. This is the thing that keeps reasserting itself over and over and over. And I don't think we will ever get away from the problems, even if the types of tools that get applied to them cycle a lot. If GitHub and the simplicity of its merging, branching, pull request type stuff, and the ubiquity of baseline Markdown and the fact that even, the GitHub editor, you can go in and do that stuff. If those hadn't gotten baked into GitHub, I don't think that a lot of static site generators would be anywhere near as popular as they are, just because, it'd be oh, well, how do I go do this? I guess in order to publish something, it's a command line thing. And if I need to collaborate with someone, well, now I'm literally doing git pushes and merges on written word. So those tools emerge, even when their emergence and the assumption that those are just there and part of the ecosystem means that we can take shortcuts around other problems in the tools we build. That becomes one of those environmental constraints that you were talking about earlier. It's the presence of a ubiquitous, markdown aware, branching tool.
Database.
Essential, database.
It's a database utility, basically.
Yeah.
That's what it is. Yeah.
And I joke that anything is a CMS if you're brave enough. The Z drive, the shared network drive on the DOS on the PC network that everyone just dumps their files into is a CMS. If an organization is willing to put up with the ups and downs and pros and cons of using just an agreed upon folder structure and everything's in Word docs, that is functionally a CMS. It may be problematic, but it is.
But then it means basically there are a set of needs. There are a set of patterns to address those needs that are to some extent invariable. At least the needs are really fundamental.
Things like two people need to be able to do things and resolve both sets of things against a single thing. How that happens, whether you're using complicated algorithms or somebody needs to sort through it, that is a need.
Yeah.
Once multiple people are in play, that's a pattern that's going to assert itself that you need to deal with.
The ability to publish and to give access to something or to
access control as a pattern of need isn't a feature. It's a thing that keeps happening.
Yes. And then this is kind of like co-evolution, right? Where what was it? How many times has nature evolved a lobster?
Carcinization, I think.
Yeah,
it's nature just loves it a crab, and it just keeps making crabs over and over.
So I think the software world just loves CMSs, and it just keeps making new CMSs over and over and over again.
And who would have predicted that Git was going to turn into one of those CMSs? This is actually a pattern that we've seen with a lot of companies, that in the composable software, composable hosted software space, the last probably 2 years or so, partners that we've worked with and clients that aren't even necessarily in the CMS space, but have realized sort of at the last minute, I guess we do have a CMS. I guess, we always thought of CMSs as this thing out there that consumes our services. But now we've got clients that have been using our product for 5 years, and they need to manage different projects and different assets for those projects and, metadata about those things. And it doesn't necessarily make sense to have them write all the copy for everything that ever appears in any one of the things over in their CMS and send it over. So we've got all these different little bits of stuff that we're storing. It's oh God, we've got a CMS baked in. It's this emergent CMS inside of all of these different products. And it feels like it's been the season of companies realizing, I guess we've got a CMS. How much do we want to do that? And how much do we just have to live with it?
Do we want to rip out what we already have and replace it with something else?
Do we want to make an external system capable of capturing all that stuff a hard dependency? Or do we want to be able to own it in order to allow people to use our product in a way that's consistent, regardless of what they're integrating with? So we own that and we can push it or pull or whatever. But those are complicated decisions that boil down to, what is our core content that we need to manage, and versus letting something else manage it and send it over to us. And there you go. It's content management system. You've got it.
So I think probably we can start touching on the other topic. So what does this all mean for like a post-AI world? Because like, how is the post-AI internet going to evolve? And so this is where this idea came up of like a semantic cache, where basically, so when you take your Confluence documentation, that's like wikis where people have gone wild and done all kind of crazy stuff, and you try to turn it into product documentation and publish on your developer portal, like you're probably going to do some standardization. You're going to like have a more structured data model, and so on. And then when you publish that to the internet, now this is actually kind of like a semantic cache of that documentation that exists somewhere else that your LLM or your AI can use internally, but also other AIs can use externally. And this was this idea that actually documentation sites are caches, they're semantic caches, especially in a post-AI world, because or even with humans, because they're taking concepts that might be explained really, really difficultly. They've transformed them in a certain formats that makes them easier to process, because there's a standardization, just like schema.org, that's like a certain serialization of that information.
An agreed upon language
Yes.
to represent a domain specific set of concepts so that you can consistently like talk about them and exchange information.
So I think, so what I realized was if you, because people are now really busy with training LLMs, but like it takes months to train one and it costs gazillions. So like we're not going to keep doing that. Like it just doesn't make any sense. You're not going to every week, you're not going to retrain your LLM on all your data. So you have a problem because you've trained your LLM on all your company information, all the support tickets, your Confluence wikis, your documentation. You've thrown it all in there, and now one day later, it's already out of date because you've just launched a new product, and now that documentation that I was talking about, it's something that used to work, is no longer working.
Well, and I think that like I think this is where it becomes really important at a technical level to distinguish between training an LLM and using. Okay, I'll back up for a second. Like what you just described there of saying like, oh, so we've got all our documentation and we've got all our stuff and we've used it to train the LLM. Like at least the vast majority of companies aren't actually training an LLM using that stuff. What they're doing is taking an LLM that was trained to work with language, big L language, like stuff in a number of human spoken languages has these patterns, and thus, we can map out semantic associations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then using that to do a lot of the hard work of finding things that match certain interests or, sort of zones of information or, like kinds of information sense in raw data, and then using other more classic tools like, oh, we chunked this up by paragraph and we've stored it in a big database. And, that's actually what's being retrieved. The LLM doesn't know all that information. We're just sort of using semantic matching and associative stuff as a shortcut for what would otherwise be untenably complex tagging processes or things like that. We're essentially using it as a search tool, or maybe then a layer of rephrasing and summarizing and stitching together several of these different pieces that we've retrieved. Like the LLM and the training of the LLM is the whole promise of the field, is that shoveling a sufficient amount of generic stuff in makes it possible to use it in other kinds of specialized situations without explicitly training it in those dialects or whatever. Like that the idea of, sort of skill transfer or ability transfer, like, oh, the LLM can do math, not because we taught it the rules of math, but because we shoveled enough stuff into it that happened to have math in it that it learned math along the way. And I think the challenge is that what I think we've found, at this point, what we know is that LLMs and transformers don't and can't learn math. They can learn mathiness. Like, this is the shape of mathy things. And like, oh, that's an equation right there. Or, oh, that's E equals MC squared. I don't understand relativity, but in this associative map of semantic space, I understand that E equals MC squared is a kind of token of meaning that has a certain kind of connection to other ideas, but it couldn't derive that. It could maybe realize that if you say, can you explain E equals MC squared to me, given a large enough body of training data, it could recognize that someone's asking for an explanation of something, and what it wants explained is E equals MC squared. And statistically, that probably means they would like the equation broken out, or they would like a high-level explanation of what the concept of relativity means, because that's how other people have answered the question. There's a lot of utility to that, but like that distinction between it knows math versus it can talk mathy and it is critical, because what feels like the next frontier of what people are trying to do with actual implementations built on LLMs is carving out more and more of those domain-specific zones where precision and real, actual, concrete, known meaning and processes or rules are really important. Carving those out and using more, I guess, classical constrained designed systems to handle those kinds of things, even if there's an LLM sort of soup in which all those isolated solutions float, where the LLM may be handling things like turning a natural language query into, oh, someone is asking about API documentation for this API, and because of this phrase, they probably mean this version of it. So that's where we'll start our search, and then sort of punting the work onto things like linters, or, I think one of the reasons that code and, code generation with LLMs has really, even with all of its drawbacks, it's been powerful, is because there's this whole ecosystem of like abstract syntax trees that codify the actual real structure of a given programming language in a mathematically verifiable fashion, and linters that can enforce styling conventions and stuff like that. That is a perfect example of those, like, no, that is a hard and fast designed system for determining what is the shape of this code. Is it executable? Is it correct, or whatever? And training an LLM to just know in some hazy fashion that, yeah, that's good code isn't what's happening. No. We've got a system that recognizes, oh, that's Python. That looks like Python. So then we punt it off to the Python linter and the Docker container that spins up in order to actually execute it and see if see what the output is, and see if there's any errors that run and whatever, and then that feeds back in perhaps, and the LLM may use that to generate its textual answer. Coming back to your question, this idea of, I think, a post-AI world, functionally, I think that natural language interfaces are definitely going to become more and more of a baseline expectation, but the underlying mechanics of what they do and the operations that they perform and what happens once a natural language request is made still, I think, is going to be in the domain of careful design and hammered out agreements and like internally in an organization, not just saying, hey, here's our 19 wikis, ask the LLM to organize them. You could, but it's not necessarily going to do anything useful or effective for you. It's you are going to build the conceptual framework that you need and explain to the machine either via code or natural language that gets turned into patterns that it will attempt to match and use what it is that you need it to get out of there. And, there's a certain point at which you're like, well, 50 regexes and 50 regexes and some templates is going to get us 75% of the way there with the vast majority of our stuff. Like, I don't think, again, I don't think that's ever going to go away, but there's like that layer of smoothing on top of turning natural language dialogue or requests into that I think LLMs, they bring a level of smoothness to that I don't think we'd ever seen, that was just, fantasy and dreams or the work of, chatbot developers painstakingly writing different conversation trees and figuring out how they were all going to need to interact. We're responsible for that sort of fluidness. And I think the post AI world, I think, is probably going to mean there's more an expectation that stuff will be exposed in some way in a structured format. But I think that will also create more and more need for the actual structural questions to be tackled, because there will be more of an expectation for these systems to be able to work with them. And that's functionally impossible to do correctly or successfully without that underlying work. So like it's going to, ironically, it's going to drive the need and demand for that underlying human conceptual architecture, even if the desired output is an AI being able to just talk to people about it.
The interesting thing is that to enable this interactive experience, we need that structured content probably somewhere. And then actually the web can fulfill that function, just like GitHub is a public database utility. The web becomes a semantic structured information.
As long as everyone is disciplined about how it gets exposed, how it gets marked up, like, and that, whether it's schema.org stuff or whatever.
It might be a little bit permissive in the beginning, but the more the more you're away from the standards, the more expensive it will be to process that information, the more unlikely your stuff is going to get picked up.
And to be clear, like, expensive in that sense isn't a matter of like, you've got to like turn the AI dial up higher and more expensive in order to parse fuzzier and fuzzier things. It's more human labor has to come into the picture to solve certain questions because it's not parsable. What you need is a person to come in and do that.
Or there was a story about ChatGPT doing like their latest model being able to solve these ARC. I don't know if you heard this. That there's like a set of benchmarks for intelligence that they've developed, and ChatGPT was able to solve it. But then the kicker was like, I don't know how many millions of dollars it costed in compute to be able to solve these problems. And it's basically because you just paralyze a whole ginormous amount of guesses. And it's like, and then you can solve it, but it's just really, really expensive.
And then there's the corollary question of like, well, are you familiar with Goodhart's law?
I've heard,
Like it was originally like I think it was in the 70s. Technically, somebody else coined it first, but then like Goodhart phrased it in a way that ended up sort of becoming, anchored. It's basically when a benchmark becomes a target, it ceases, or when a measure becomes a goal, it ceases to become a useful measure.
Yeah.
Because now it's just what's being worked towards. And it comes into that idea of like, in analytics and stuff like that, distinguishing between what you are really trying to accomplish and what's a proxy measurement that you think sort of correlates to making progress on it. And once that becomes a goal in and of itself, it becomes decoupled from the thing you really cared about. And like in this sense, like that's one of the challenges with benchmarks for AI. It's like, well, to what extent have we now made a thing that is good at answering certain kinds of word problems versus intelligence? And it's like progress keeps being made on those things, but then when we pointed at other kinds of questions that intuitively to us seem obvious as, so a smart thing could do this. And then, sort of it's back to square one. And like, I think that's the challenge of like trying to use, and like, ChatGPT is a perfect example of this because like ChatGPT is not a giant LLM, like under the hood, although it's proprietary, like the best guess is it is a giant pile of multiple different LLMs that have been sort of pushed in different areas of specialization for certain kinds of tasks, and task-specific non-LLM systems, like, whether it's code linters for different languages or an API that, goes to Expedia and looks up airplane flights or whatever. Like, those are all of the sort of, the elves in the workshop behind that, that facade that are doing all of those detailed, this actually has to be correct, not just the shape of it, but the actual thing itself must be correct for this to work. What we're now talking about as an AI isn't an LLM. It's like the LLM is one of these building blocks that we get to use. I mean, my personal feeling is that the footprint of the LLM in that is going to shrink over time, or what we talk about as an LLM is going to grow to have those other kinds of non-LLM things jammed inside of it, or some permutation of those things. Like even tool use in LLMs is a perfect example of that. It's like you haven't made an LLM that knows how to book flights. What you've made is an LLM that recognizes the shape of a request for a flight and kicks it off to something that actually knows how to do that. That process relies on people figuring out, here's a thing that we need it to be able to do. So let's make the thing that does that and wire it into this. I'm still deeply skeptical about the idea that generalized approach of like shoving generalized information into a system will ever get us over the hurdle of knowing how to do other things versus making it easier and quicker to recognize when the work has to get punted off, if that makes sense.
Well, I was thinking about like enzymes, or like in a cell, you have a certain shape that's waiting for a molecule to fit in.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's something similar where content, like structured content, fulfills this function as like a skeleton of it needs to have this shape to fit here. And then the LLM can be like very chaotic. Just like in the cell, there's some processes where certain molecules are shepherded to another location. But some processes just like, it's a soup, it's a crazy mess. And once in a while, it just finds the right spot and then magic happens.
And this is interesting too, because the idea behind like, okay, so a system like that is also, and this is how certain like vaccines and, health preventative health measures work, blocking certain receptors so that a known virus can't bind to those receptors or something like that is one of many tools to that. And the answer isn't like, oh yes, the immune system knows a particular thing. It's like, no, it's shapes.
Oh,
it's like
yeah.
it's binding to shapes.
Yes.
It does, like the immune system doesn't understand viruses as a concept. It binds to shapes and it does certain things given certain stimuli, and it works as a system, but like it's dangerous to say, oh, well, my body understands viruses, or it understands the concept of foreignness, or something like that. It's like, if we're casually chatting, okay, but like when you get down to brass tacks, the distinctions matter deeply because making the wrong assumption means radically different outcomes. And similarly, like the question of like a lot of structured content is making explicit what is implicit in natural language or in otherwise fuzzier things. It's saying, well, we want to make this easier to be clear about. So we're going to put this tag around it, or we're always going to put an all caps heading at the top. And that's how it will become obvious that this is in fact the subject matter, or, something like that. And in the case of an LLM parsing that kind of stuff, like a lot, like, does it know JSON format, or does it know XML in like the knows sense? Or is it just, has it had enough examples of JSON and XML and Markdown that given certain nudges, it produces things in that format? And like, I think an example is, I might have mentioned this on our last podcast. Mm-hmm. I use a graph, a document graph multimodal database called ArangoDB for a lot of my personal projects. And it has its own idiosyncratic query language called AQL. That's sort of like, it's a little SQL-like, but it's also like JavaScript structured. So like you're essentially writing little snippets of code to execute queries against this graph, document data against this document graph. But it also doesn't have enough examples out there. It's just not common enough that it's the training set. When you say, hey, I need an AQL query for ArangoDB that gets this information, this information, this information, every single time, given just a generic LLM answering that question, it kind of picks up, depending on how large the training set was. It's like, oh, yes, I understand ArangoDB. It'll get like the syntax, the first couple of bits right, and then drifts into SQL. And it's like inevitably, it like drifts into SQL about halfway through. And you're like, nope. Also, no. You started strong, but now you're writing a SQL query again, because syntactically, like semantically, it's still on the right track. It's like it's taking this thing that I told it to do, and it's kind of doing it, but it doesn't have enough pattern to follow to actually stay on track inside of a particular syntax constraint. So barring, oh yeah, we recognize you asked for an AQL query, so we're going to punt out to an AQL linter and, use that, use this tool that knows AQL to do it. It drifts off course. And I think like that feels to me like an example of the kind of challenge that the semantic modeling world has when interacting with LLMs, like, starting to add more, say, markup around it or to follow certain conventions, the value is in the pattern we've decided on. We're doing the civilization level work of making a new pattern that makes explicit what was previously implicit. And large language models can follow along with those can follow those patterns as they emerge and become more prevalent. But it's still a real challenge to say, to describe a kind of uncommon pattern and ask it to look for it. That is very, very difficult with most LLMs that I've worked with, because even the asking of it, it's just looking for things that sound like what I said, not necessarily understanding, oh, here is a conceptual pattern you're describing. Now I can go look for that. And it's that making explicit what was implicit that makes sort of the hooks we hang those requests onto, the recognizable keywords that clarify, oh, yes, this is what I'm looking at, and this is what I was asking for. The standardization of those things, I think, is what continually ups the game and ups the accuracy level with that stuff. We'll have to do a second podcast.
We'll have to do another one. Yes.
That's it for this episode. This episode of the Resilience Podcast was brought to you by Pronovix. You can learn more about our company at pronovix.com, and thank you for listening.